pleased to welcome three distinguished guests who will be discussing Giuseppina D'Oro book entitled Why Collingwood Matters. Giuseppina's book is not a summary of Collingwood's philosophy, nor biography, but rather an attempt to initiate a debate from a Collingwoodian point of view on contemporary issues related to the opposition or distinction between humanistic understanding and scientific knowledge in philosophy of mind and philosophy of history. As debate is the key word here, a roundtable discussion seemed to be the best way to introduce this book. And taking part in this discussion is, of course, Giuseppina D'Oro. She's a Collingwood specialist and the joint editor of Collingwood's essay on philosophical method. She's also the author of several books on Collingwood, namely Collingwood and the Metaphysics of Experience. We also have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Herman Simissen from Oulu University, Netherlands, who is a researcher in philosophy of history, and he recently wrote, among other many things, a book on Theodore Lessing, Theodore Lessing's philosophy of history in its time, and he worked also on Collingwood. And finally, Charles Pence, director, here in Louvain-la-Neuve of the Center for the Philosophy of Science and Societies. And he's a philosopher and historian of sciences. And among other things too, he's editor of a book to be published on scientific methodology in 19th century Britain. And I think that Kevin is maybe giving some indication about how the discussion will be ruled, or do you want me to
no, I can go on. Well, let me start again by thanking you all three of you to accept to participate in this roundtable. The way it will be done is the same as last year. We have a similar event. We'll start with a short presentation of 10 minutes from each of you, and then we start the discussion among the three of you that will be moderated by Baudouin and myself. And afterward, if there is time left, we'll open the discussion to the public, and that's how it will go. So
Giuseppina,
if you have nothing else to say,
no.
The floor is yours. Thank you again.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to discuss the work. I hadn't quite fully prepared for this, so as you can see, I'm very high tech, and I just jotted a few notes. But I thought that what I would do is to say a little bit about, how the book was conceived. So it's very much a broad brush book that, as Baudouin said, is trying to bring Collingwood's, especially his metaphilosophy, to bear upon certain contemporary debates. Now, Collingwood is often known for being the most famous amongst the neglected philosophers, so everybody knows him for being a neglected philosopher. But one of the things which hasn't actually happened is that his work has not really been, well, with some qualifications, very often it's not really brought to bear about broader issues in philosophy. This wasn't always true. I mean, for example, in the 1950s and 60s, he was very much the inspiration figure behind W.H. Drey's defense of the autonomy of history in the debate with Hempel. But what that shows is that it is, and when that happened, his work was, in fact, brought to the attention of a wider range of philosophers. So there are some historic reasons as to why I think Collingwood was neglected. Possibly, he was a bit unlucky in terms of the time in which he was writing, because he was one of the late British idealists that was somewhat lumped together with with a school of thought that was becoming very unpopular with the rise of analytic philosopher, and it was kind of quickly dismissed for that reason. So in some sense, he was a little bit unlucky in terms of the time in which he was writing. I think, however, that what is happening now is a little bit different. Certainly, perhaps in the heyday of towards the end of the 20th century, when metaphysics and by metaphysics here, I don't mean Collingwood's metaphysics, but sort of a more kind of ontologically robust conception of metaphysics, became very prominent in a kind of ontological backlash against the linguistic turn, you could see why people would not have really been interested in his work, because he has a very different conception of what metaphysics is, which is not ontologically very robust. But so you can see why, there were certain periods of time, there are philosophical fashions that come and go, and why he might have been neglected at certain junctures. However, more recently there has been interest, for renewed interest in metaphilosophy, to which I think whether you agree with him or not, he can definitely make a contribution. And also there's been a renewed interest in the question of scientism. So there's been several books on the nature of scientism, and I think his conception of scientism, although he doesn't necessarily directly engage with that, is relevant. So I think that if there is a time where perhaps his work could be seen as making a contribution, there are these debates there's the renewed interest in second order questions about the role and character of philosophical analysis that went out of fashion when philosophers, I suppose, wanted to focus on first order questions and not on the kind of second order metaphilosophical questions. So perhaps this is time. Now, I suppose that in some ways what spurred me to kind of provide an account of Collingwood's non-reductivism and his defense of the autonomy of humanistic understanding goes back to when I was an undergraduate and I was taking classes in the philosophy of mind. And when I was taking classes in the philosophy of mind, we were presented with all these non-reductivist positions, and what was this non-reductivism? Well, you could be a token physicalist, or you could be a functionalist. Of course, today panpsychism perhaps is bigger, but those forms of non-reductivism I always found very, very unsatisfactory. I never really felt that they were addressing the question of what it means to provide explanations which belong to the domain of the mind. But the philosophy of mind somehow, had all there had been this non-reductivist backlash against reductivism, but this non-reductivist backlash, in fact, shared very much the same kind of naturalistic assumptions as reductivism. So what struck me is that if you wanted to have a more robust form of non-reductivism, then in some sense you had to address the metaphilosophical underpinnings of these positions. So what struck me is that the forms of non-reductivism which were available pretty much accepted certain assumptions both about the relationship between philosophy and science and about the relationship between different forms of knowledge or different sciences. What are these assumptions that we're sharing? I suppose insofar as they were committed to some form of broadly naturalistic assumptions, they assumed that a conception of philosophy as the underlaborer of science, which has given over to physics the attempt to come to know the ultimate constituents of reality, and then takes on a subsidiary role. And what that does is that it puts, I suppose, forms of knowledge which are not physics in competition with physics. So it creates competition between, if you accept a conception of philosophy of the underlaborer of science, then what happens is that you take physics to be the science which takes on, in the way how Collingwood might put it, the role of the science of pure being, of metaphysics traditionally conceived, and then there arises a problem of causal overdeterminations or causal exclusion, which of this science gives us the kind of correct explanation. Now, Collingwood's kind of non-reductivism is different. It begins from different metaphilosophical assumptions because it neither thinks of, I suppose, philosophy as trying to do what science does, which is to say to give us knowledge of the ultimate constituents of reality, nor does it hand over to physics that role and takes over the role of the under-laborer. But on the other hand, he puts forward a very different conception of what metaphysics does. And what metaphysics does, in his view, is to provide a reflection on the very fundamental assumptions which govern different forms of knowledge. And in so doing, it is not conflicting. Philosophy doesn't conflict with science because it doesn't do the same thing. It doesn't try to give us knowledge or first-order knowledge. It gives us a kind of second-order reflection on the presuppositions which make knowledge possible. So I think that what Collingwood believes, he doesn't put it in these words, but that it's the first-order sciences that give you knowledge. If you want knowledge, you ask a biologist, you ask a physicist, you ask a historian, but a philosopher gives you something else. This is not to say that it is invaluable, but that it is a different kind of enterprise. So what Collingwood develops is not non-reductivism as that is normally kind of couched within the philosophy of mind, which I suppose was the bit of of analytic philosophy that I was more sort of exposed to. But what he develops is a form of explanatory pluralism, which claims that there are different complexes of questions and answers that respond to different explanatory needs or different explanatory goals, and that which do not compete, and that answers to questions that arise as a result of the making of different absolute presuppositions do not conflict with one another, because answers to questions can conflict with one another only if they are actually answering the same questions. But if historians and physicists are not asking the same questions, then their knowledge does not conflict. Now, what also attracted me to his metaphilosophy is that although on the one hand you could say that his approach is deflationist, because it's claiming, look, there isn't a conflict between the historian and the physicist. And by historian, Collingwood has a conception of history as a humanistic enterprise. He thinks of history as the science of mind in ways that need to probably be explained and clarified. And maybe I can do that as we go along. What is it I was going to say? What was I saying? So he develops a form of explanatory pluralism that is quite different because it claims that there are different complexes of questions and answers, that the kind of questions that are raised in one domain of inquiry arise because of certain presuppositions which are not made in others, and therefore the answers do not conflict because they're actually answers to different questions. But this is what I was going to say. So what attracted me to this metaphilosophy is that on the one hand his approach was deflationary, but it wasn't making light of this problem. So say, well, this is a serious problem. So the problem of the relationship between different forms of inquiry is an important issue that we should address. It's not just some sort of silly error that philosophers have made at a particular historical point in time. So that's what attracted me to his conception of philosophy, the fact that on the one hand there is a deflationary element within it, but on the other hand it's not really making light of these philosophical issues. It's taking them seriously. Now, another thing that I think is interesting about Collingwood is that if one reads him in a particular way, and Collingwood has often been read as promoting a certain kind of historical relativism, or historicism is one of those words that is used in so many different ways, and it's not helpful, but is often read as an historicist in the sense that he is an historical relativist who believes that what the philosopher does is to find out what people believe in different periods of time. Yeah. But if you don't read him like that, so if you read it on the other hand as trying to find out what assumptions are underpinning, what axiological assumptions are underpinning forms of knowledge, or what is it that underpins certain kind of questions, yeah, not what people believe, then you can see that his project was not so much to defend historical relativism, but rather to undermine a form of scientism, understood in the sense of the mistaken belief that there can be knowledge, that there is a form of knowledge that is presuppositionless. And that is what he genuinely... So he didn't assert that all knowledge is historical, that is how it is often read, but the way in which I presented his work is that he is opposing a form of scientism as the commitment to the belief that there is a form of knowledge that is presuppositionless, yeah? And the claim that all knowledge is historical knowledge and that there is no knowledge that is presuppositionless, I think are not the same claim. And above all, what attracted me to what he's doing is that, very often, if you deny a position, then you end up on the other side of the fence in an unhelpful way. So on the one, sometimes, what is people who criticize scientism then end up endorsing a certain kind of historicism, which is as bad as the scientism that they criticize, which is to say, if you think that all knowledge is historical knowledge, and that you think of scientific knowledge in those terms, then in some sense you commit the opposite error. And what Collingwood is doing, instead of turning things upside down, is saying historical knowledge, in the sense of humanistic knowledge, rests on different presuppositions than scientific knowledge. Both rest on presuppositions which are of a different nature, that are of different kind. But he is not, I suppose, defending a form of upside down scientism which turns history, if you like, into or gives to history the kind of position of epistemic privilege that, on the other hand, scientism as it is normally conceived gives to science. So that was also something that attracted me to what he's doing. And when you read him like that, he is occupying a distinctive position in the sort of landscape of contemporary philosophy of history, because most contemporary philosophy of history after the 1960s has undergone a narrativist turn, which often goes hand in hand with a kind of form of relativism which says that we understand the past from the perspective of the present. And that's not what Collingwood wants to say. In fact, he wants to say that one of the presuppositions of historical knowledge is that you understand the past from the perspective of the past. And that's why he thinks of history of the subject matter of history as action, because he thinks that what it does is to try to understand the past from the presuppositions of the agents who lived in that past. And he believes that the presuppositions of history so understood are very different from the presuppositions of on the other hand, pursuits which are non-humanistic in nature. So that is, I suppose, how the book was conceived, and why, and how it tries to show what his conception of metaphysics is, and why it differs from traditional, conception of metaphysics, and why, if you want a more robust form of non-reductivism, you need to sort of rethink some of the metaphilosophical assumptions that are being made. So.
Okay, thank you. Yes. So, Dr. Ahmed Smith, if you want to present what you have to say on that matter, please.
I will try.
Thank you.
I've got the text, but I don't want to read it, so I'm going to try to do it by heart. If I panic, I take my glasses out and start reading after all. But I don't think that will be necessary. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to attend this meeting. It's always nice to talk about Collingwood, whom I think is the most important philosopher of history of the last century. Probably including the first 25 years of this century as well. I first got acquainted with Collingwood when I studied history, so my background is in history, and I had to follow a course on the philosophy of history with Jan van der Dussen, author of History as a Science, which is by now a minor classic, or even a classic in Collingwood studies. And I was immediately fascinated by Collingwood, by reading Collingwood, and that was mainly because he was a philosopher of history at last, who had an intimate knowledge of historical investigation and of historical research, whereas most other philosophers of history never wrote history at all, never practiced history. So he was someone with an intimate knowledge of the discipline, which is very nice for an historian. And moreover, he wrote very clear and very beautiful English, which attracted me as well. And I can say I've been studying his work ever since. So that's I studied in the last millennium, I'm afraid. So that's quite a time ago. So I've been reading and studying Collingwood ever since. The occasion of today's meeting is, of course, Professor D'Oro's book on Collingwood, Why Collingwood Matters. I did read that with much pleasure. I think it's a very interesting book. I think it's a very good book, mainly because it, for me as an historian, it emphasizes once more the need of distinguishing between various kinds of knowledge. Collingwood time and again emphasizes that history is a different discipline. It's a study on its own. It's a science on its own, different from the natural sciences, but not inferior to the natural sciences. That's what he says time and again. You often hear that, well, no, it is interesting, but the natural sciences are far more important. That is what Collingwood denies. They're asking different questions. They're answering their questions in different ways. And that's what's important for him. For us in our culture, it's never questioned that a natural scientist can answer every question they want, whereas for historians it is. So it is taken for granted if you say, well, a scientist can't answer an historical question, people say, well, probably they can. Well, the other way around, we say an historian can't answer a scientific question. No, everyone says, yeah, that's obvious. But the other way around, for some reason or another, it's not obvious. And I don't understand why. And Collingwood makes a very good point of it, claiming that, yeah, there are different kinds of examinations, and they give different answers and don't mix them up. That's very important, and that's especially what Professor D'Oro elucidates very well in her book. What's the heart of the matter with the humanistic explanations? Just what she said before. You go back to the presuppositions of the people who lived in the past, and you try to answer questions about the past by taking these considerations, these presuppositions into consideration. I don't fully agree with her that you don't ask your questions from the past. Collingwood often use, to quote Croce, saying all history is the history of the present. All history is contemporary history, is the right quote, I think. So you do ask your questions from the past, but Collins has this idea of encapsulation. past thought is encapsulated in present thought. So we have to do with both. And you don't say the present is not important, the present is important as well. So if you try to understand the past agent, you don't become a past person, you stay the present person, but you think about the past. And you try to understand that past thought. The answer of the examples given by Professor D'Oro are very clarifying. So she often gives the example of Caesar crossing the Rubicon. You can't understand that if you don't know what crossing the Rubicon meant for people in antiquity. It was not just crossing a river, it was crossing a border, which a Roman general was not supposed to do. And you can't understand this act if you don't know that. So the presuppositions of the people of the past you definitely need to know. But if you know them, you know it's nothing less but a coup d'etat what he did by crossing the Rubicon. Another example shows a lot of foresight, because you mentioned the example of people gathering in St. Peter's Square in Rome, cheering when white smoke is coming out of the chimney. That shows foresight, because that happened only a couple of weeks ago, and now we are discussing it. But you can only understand that fact. Why do people cheer when white smoke comes out of a chimney on St. Peter's Square if you know it is a message for the people in the square that the new pope has been elected? Again, you need to know the presuppositions of the people involved to understand the act. By the way, Collingwood always emphasizes this kind of humanistic understanding. It's exactly the way we understand people in daily life, just in practice. So it's nothing special. Historians are specialized to do questions about answering questions about the past on actions by humans, but in practice, if you want to understand other people, you do exactly the same humanistic or historical understanding. In the build-up of the argument of Professor D'Oro, there was only one chapter where I fully did not agree, and that was what you mentioned at the end, where you say Collingwood seems to imply that we can know the past as it was. I don't think that's the case at all. Collingwood himself was a constructivist, I think. He definitely states the past as it was is gone, and we can't go back to that past as it was. But it did leave all kinds of traces behind, and we can use these traces as evidence to answer questions about the past. In doing so, we build up an image of the past, but that image of the past, of course, is not the past itself. Collingwood time and again writes, history is what the evidence obliges us to believe, and for me that implies that he's a constructivist himself. So he has a constructivist view of history. Where I do agree with Professor D'Oro is that he definitely did not give up the idea of truth in history. And that is what modern day or more fashionable constructivists did. He tried to save that idea of truth in history by developing his own theory of truth. Of course, you can't have a correspondence theory of truth with regard to history. You can't compare what you write about the past with the past itself, as the past itself is gone. But Collingwood developed a kind of coherence theory of truth, where he says the relation between evidence and the propositions the historian makes, that is where truth in history is. So there's always evidence related, and the better you can underpin what you say with evidence, the more true your history is. So he never wanted to give up the idea of truth. That's where I fully agree with you. Finally, I would like to conclude with a few remarks on why Collingwood Matters matters. Why is this book so very important? Because Professor D'Oro hints at it in the last chapter of her books. If you don't understand the nature of action, you can't act properly. You give the example of people dealing with the climate problems we have today. You can't take the proper actions if you don't know what human action is about. And you can give numerous examples of current problems where you really need a good understanding of what human action is. before you can act properly. But Collingwood himself, in his autobiography, dwells on this topic very largely, very angrily, especially in the chapter on the foundations of the future. He goes into this problem, blaming scientism for the First World War. He points at the contrast that there is in Western culture between the ability to control natural processes and natural forces and the disability to control human problems, human situations, where humans are the actors and where mental forces are playing a role. That's an enormous contrast, and you say what we need in our current culture is more understanding of what people do and how to handle situations where people are involved. That is where our society, where our culture fails. And here he's referring to Western culture really since early modern times. We all concentrate on what natural sciences do. We revere natural sciences, but we completely neglected what the historical sciences is, and that's exactly what we need. Does he want to return to the old idea of historia magistra vitae, history as the teacher of life? No, not at all. He says history is not an enormous amount of examples which you can use to handle the situation in the present, not at all. But he says what his history is learning you, what you develop by studying history is insight in situations where you've never been before. And he makes the beautiful comparison with a woodsman. If you go into a wood with a woodsman, the woodsman can show you all kinds of things you won't see if you're there without that woodsman, when you're not a trained woodsman yourself. So he has expertise which you don't have. The same holds for the historian. The historian has expertise in situations and understanding situations which someone who is not trained as an historian has not. And that is very important. Only if you have that understanding you can have the right actions, and that's very important. You need to have the idea of what human understanding is, what human action is, and both are completely related to do the right actions in the present. And I think we should thank Professor D'Oro for elucidating the importance of this point for us. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you very much. Charles, if you want to participate in the debate.
This is my cue to just run out of the room. Right?
Yeah. You don't have to, but okay.
No, thanks for the invitation and thanks for the book. I really had a lot of fun. I really had a lot of fun unpacking the especially the portion on the epistemology of history and the question of scientism. This debate that into which Collingwood enters, as you say, it's not without contemporary importance at all. I think it's a question that deserves to be carefully evaluated. Let me do a 30-second idea, a sketch of what the sort of thrust of my comments will be, and then I'll try to get into detail about the points that arise. Very briefly. So I take it that a lot of Collingwood's interventions in this question about the difference between the epistemology of science and the epistemology of history rely on the particular ways in which he constructs what science and history are. He has quite precise ideas, at least as Professor D'Oro reconstructs them, about what it is to be engaged in doing science and what it is to be engaged in doing history. And what I want to try to do is unpack those a bit, get worried about that distinction, because I'm not certain that distinction holds up to recent work in philosophy of history and especially in contemporary philosophy of science. And then I want to try to figure out what that means for the argument regarding scientism. So let me see if I can do some justice to those things here. So at face value, this science versus history distinction is very starkly drawn, right? For Collingwood, science is the process of referring an explanation to a universal law, right? And so it's not for nothing that in Professor D'Oro's introductory remarks, physics stood in for science a lot of the time. I think that's absolutely the paradigmatic science that Collingwood has in mind as he constructs what he's doing. That already, from the perspective of a contemporary philosopher of science, is a bit dangerous. It's not even clear that that's what physicists are on about in the 21st century. And it's particularly not clear, as I am a philosopher and historian of the life sciences, it's not that that's ever what the life sciences have been up to. Historians then are referring explanations, instead of to bring them under the scope of universal laws, they're referring explanations to the norm-guided actions of agents. At least as I'm reading the reconstruction. I confess my sum total of Collingwood reading is like 10 pages when I was a graduate student, and so that's going to be really fuzzy, and I'm not going to pretend to remember it. It was instilled in me as a very young scholar when I was getting training in how to do a job interview, that one of the most dangerous things you can say is, "Oh yes, I've read that." For the PhD students in the room, consider that a lesson. Don't ever utter that sentence unless you're very sure. So I'm not very sure. So history is referring the act of historical explanation, the act, perhaps a bit more broadly, of humanistic explanation, is to refer phenomena to the norm-guided actions of agents. And that, obviously, if for no other reasons than kind of classic naturalistic fallacy kinds of concerns, is obviously a distinction that we have to take seriously. And that, I think, is really nicely drawn. There is certainly an aspect. Right here is where I was going to do, my remarks are going to be a little short, because right here is where I was going to do the Caesar crossing the Rubicon example, but now it's already been done for you. So what does it mean to refer an action to the norm-guided behavior, to a phenomenon, to the norm-guided actions of an agent? Well, it's about realizing what it meant for that to have been wrong, what it meant for that to have been a problem, what it meant for that to have been an event that was worth pointing out, that was worth remarking on, right? And for that, we have to have this normative layer in the way in which we understand what's going on when Caesar walks across a stream. Let me make a little bit of trouble now, because I feel like that's why we're here. First, I want to make a little bit of trouble with the admittedly small but the non-zero amount of the philosophy of history that I know, which is I do want to at least take 90 seconds to 2 minutes to stick up for the narrativist conception of history and contemporary philosophy of history. So, as Professor D'Oro briefly mentioned, this is a recent tradition via which the sort of unit of analysis for a philosopher of history becomes the historical narrative that we tell about the event that we care about. And of course, if we're telling a narrative, in part that means that is something that's for us. It's in our categories, it's constructed from our ingredients, it's told from my point of view as a historian. I have one book in the history of science, I'm going to claim the label. A good example of this kind of thing is an author that Professor D'Oro talks about a bit in the book for a couple of paragraphs. Philip Roth, who's done some really interesting work in the analysis of what he calls narrative sentences. So what is it that makes a narrative interesting? It's that in part it's composed of narrative sentences. What is it that makes a narrative sentence interesting? Well, from my point of view, I could find it very interesting and in fact quite controversial to utter the sentence, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the event that sort of kicked off the First World War, right? The reason that that's a weird sentence, epistemologically speaking, is for Archduke Franz Ferdinand it makes absolutely no sense at all, right? He had no concept of the First World War. He was dead. But I mean, shortly before being dead, he had no concept of the First World War. He was unable to formulate that. The reason that that's controversial is not because of who he was or his particular normative commitments in that moment. It is because we have an analytic category called the First World War that we consider particularly pregnant, interesting, useful. We want to understand and fight about why we apply it when we apply it. I feel like that's not an isolated example. Of course, it's a cherry-picked example. It's the example that makes the theory look as good as you could possibly make the theory, because it becomes logically impossible even to think about having thought that thought at that time. I understand that. It's clearly the best possible case. That said, I still think it's an interesting case, and I still think that there's an important part of what historians are about that looks like that. There is an important part of my own work that looks like trying to understand my First World War. When did contemporary mathematical evolutionary theory really take the shape that it takes, right? And that's a question that doesn't make sense for my actors, but it is still a question that I think I care about. Now we've exhausted my knowledge of the philosophy of history, so now that's my cue to flee screaming from the room. No, it's my cue to turn to the sciences. And here what I want to do is at least briefly talk about a tradition in the philosophy of the historical sciences that's developed, especially in the last, I would say 25, maybe now 30 years, for thinking about sciences like archaeology, paleontology, astronomy, or geology, where it seems like what we're doing is we're doing history with no agents. Right? I don't care as a paleontologist. Well, okay, parentheses. Perhaps I sometimes care as a paleontologist what kinds of forces in general govern the construction of the kinds of organisms in general that we find in the fossil record. That's a thing that I'm going to do some study of. But also what I care about is, how did the actual dinosaurs die? How did these dinosaurs die? Our dinosaurs. What did they turn into? Why did they look the way that they did? How am I going to answer that question? I'm going to reconstruct traces. I'm going to discover historical traces. I'm going to reconstruct them into some kind of a theory or a narrative. And I feel like what I'm doing when I do that, if I am a paleobiologist, looks a lot more like trying to understand why a series of decisions led Napoleon to a fateful day in Waterloo, then it looks like doing theoretical physics. That's the process of the distinction between processes of reasoning, which I agree is very, very important here. But it puts those scientists on the side of the historians. The worry that I have here is I don't see how to get that out of Collingwood's distinction, because I don't have any agents. I don't have any norms. I don't have any actions along this definition. But I have methodology that looks a lot like doing history. And so I'm not sure how to recover this really interesting epistemic problem that I've got, that I thought was an epistemology of history problem, from the way that Collingwood is thinking about that divide. And so for me, there is something really striking here, and this is why I enjoyed reading the book so much, because I am completely on board with this worry about epistemic pluralism. I am on board with this idea that there are radically different epistemologies at work in these different ways in which we construct human knowledge. I worry that some of the cases that I at least find, though, the most interesting of where those kinds of distinctions can be found are sort of falling out of this wedge that Collingwood wants to drive between humanistic and scientific understanding. And so then when I step back to the argument about scientism, now I feel like I have to rethink who exactly that argument is engaging, right? Because now, okay, there are still going to be physicists on the side. I have talked to several. There are still going to be, we've had several as guest speakers in this seminar series in this very room, as a matter of fact. There are still going to be physicists who are going to happily tell me that if I have not referred an explanation to a universal law, I am doing hot garbage as an intellectual scholar. Absolutely, I'm completely on board, and so James Ladyman and Stephen French, and Stephen Hawking, and I could go on. It's not that that position isn't there, but it's the question is once we take seriously the challenges coming from this kind of epistemic problematic that's being laid out here. Once we take those questions seriously, what does that turn the debate over scientism into? Because I think it doesn't look the way that it looked when Collingwood is worried about people who are going to try to, Newtonianize everything or something, right? Like, I don't think that's what today's debate should look like. But then this is an opening. I don't have a solid opinion here. What do we do when on this divide we have some historians who feel more like scientists and some scientists who feel more like historians? And I don't know how to reassemble this debate once we take that seriously. But I think it's a really, really interesting and important question. I am 1,000% on board with that. And so I think bring these resources out of Collingwood and putting them in dialogue in this contemporary context is an extremely salutary thing. And I'm hopeful that it will push more really good work on these very hard questions, because I think that's exactly that's a extremely laudable philosophical enterprise. And so with that, I'll stop talking because we should let everyone chat. But thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the three different and very different discussions. And maybe we should start the discussion properly. And if Giuseppina wants to answer first. Yes.
Yeah. So I hope I remember a lot of what is being said. It's all very interesting. And I'm going to take it backward because I think that some of the things that you were saying about constructivism, they kind of connect with some of the points that you raised. So, I mean, first of all, I think that in terms of the metaphysics of absolute presuppositions, although I have spoken of physics and so on, I think that Collingwood is doing something which is slightly more fundamental in the sense that just as what he means by history is not history understood as the kind of discipline as practiced in academic departments, but rather a way of understanding the world which rests on the presuppositions that you understand the agents through the norms that belong to their world. So I think that when he speaks about the natural sciences, what he has in mind is a kind of method of discovery that presupposes that you're looking for patterns, and that looking for patterns is somewhat different from understanding norms. So there is a distinction between laws and norms. But I don't think he is talking about the methods of physics in the sense in which physicists are actually using it. So in that sense, I think there is a disconnect between what one understands, what I describe as a form of inquiry. He doesn't use quite that word, and I suppose specific disciplines, because obviously there are those distinctions. And in a way, you might say, well, it's a little bit ironic that you're speaking about explanatory pluralism and then you bundle all the natural sciences together, and they've got, very, very different methods, and in some way. So, but I guess he is interested in the distinction, between descriptive and normative enterprises, and his distinction, and I suppose the distinction between what he would call, forms of knowledge that look for patterns is not exactly talking about physics or biology and so on. Is a much broader category. So then I think there was your point about narrativism, which hopefully then I can connect with what you were saying about constructivism. So I don't think that Collingwood would deny that you can give narratives about the past. So in that sense, I think he would accept that, of course, we can tell narratives about the past. But I think what he would deny is that in a kind of humanistic history, that narrative is seen from the point of view of the present. Now, it is true, as Danto and Roth might say, that one could not have known that the 30-year war would last 30 years on the days in which it broke, yeah? And it is true that one could not have known on the day in which Ferdinand was shot that was the cause of the First World War. I think that is true. And there is a sense in which there is a certain kind of retrospective knowledge there is only a certain kind of knowledge that can only be had with the wisdom of hindsight. I don't think he would deny the wisdom of hindsight in the sense in which, I think many people would say. But what he would say is that you couldn't even begin to understand why the shooting of Ferdinand could be a sparkle for the First World War unless you understood the system of alliances that were in place at the time. And in order to understand that, you have to understand the promises that country had made about come to each other's helps. So this idea of seeing things from the point of view of the past is not just something that applies to intellectual history, say if we're going to, or cultural history. It actually applies to history in the sense of, when people say, well, try to understand the causes of the First World War, because in some ways, there is that kind of context of system of alliances, which I suppose is similar to what is going on today. It's very dangerous because, if Ukraine were part of NATO, that could spark a world conflict. And you need to understand that, and that is something that you don't understand retrospectively. It's something that you understand from the point of view of the agents that were living at the time of Ferdinand, even if they could not have foreseen what the consequences of his shooting are. But so in that sense, we can tell those narratives. But what I would say that even that for us to be able to understand the significance of, just as in order to understand the significance of Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon, we need to understand, that it was an affront to the Senate, then in order to understand the causes of the First World War, we have to understand the system of alliances. And that, I suppose, is where I would say that, although, yes, in some sense there is a form of constructivism there, because he is not a realist, yeah? On the other hand, so he is definitely not a realist. I don't think that he is, let's say Collingwood is not realist. I don't think he is an anti-realist in the sense in which what people normally mean by constructivism have understood by anti-realism, which is to say that you see it from the point of view of the present. I think that, yes, of course, we have, there is a sense in which inevitably this is where we are, and we have to try and understand the past from the point of view of the present. But the goal is to try and understand it from the point of view of the past. There will be epistemic obstacles in the way. We do not necessarily, maybe we cannot know with 100% certainty whether we get there or not. But that's what the goal is, in a sense, because otherwise there is a sense in which history wouldn't, well, I suppose if it wouldn't be, it seems to be what it's doing that is peculiar to it. And I think it's because narrativists have tended to prioritize the perspective of the present in that sense, which is much more than just acknowledging that there is the need for, the wisdom of hindsight. I think that, that I think a lot of historians today are angry at what has been going on in the philosophy of history. I remember last year I went to a conference in Oslo, and there's been a realist backlash that is led by historians who are very militant against the kind of, a certain kind of constructivism that I don't think Collingwood is fully espousing. So I think, I don't know how to put it. Yes, not realist, but not presentist in the sense in which I think some constructivism seems to be. And I do think that in that sense he's different from narrativist because he wants to put conceptual questions before epistemological questions. So he wants to say, first of all, you have to delineate what sense of the past you are concerned with. And once you've kind of singled out what is the relevant sense of the past with which you are concerned, then in a way you look for the kind of evidence that you need in order to answer the questions that you're addressing. So some people are saying, I think that I can't remember their names, but there are some people who have argued that there are certain natural sciences, like possibly geology, which are historical sciences. And that it seems wrong from their perspective. So they would want to say that history, as humanistic historians might understand it, is in a way is in the same category as historical sciences such as geology. I think Collingwood would definitely deny that. And he would deny that, for example, that evolutionary biology, which probably is historical in that sense, is history in the sense in which he understands it. I don't think that he would deny that those are histories. So I don't think that he would say, only humanistic history is history. You can call evolutionary history history, you can call geological history history, but it's not the same as humanistic history. And I think what he would say is that in some sense, the past is an ambiguous expression. It's as ambiguous as the concept of cause that is used differently in different explanatory contexts. And that, the evolutionary biologist is doing a history, but is doing a very different kind of history. So, I don't...
Yeah, can I add on that? Because in your book you emphasized, and I think rightly so, that paleontologists, that's a difficult word for me to pronounce, they suppose that laws of nature don't change. They're the same.
So do human historians.
No.
Yes.
No.
If they presuppose... I'd be interested to read a history that imagines gravity changing since...
No, that's not my point. No.
Then what is your... Then I fail to understand the point.
Okay, I'll try to make my point clear, but you can do it better because it is an example from your book. Paleontologists suppose that laws of nature don't change, but historians do think, Romans think differently about the state than Greeks do, or than medieval people do. That's the difference.
Okay.
That's the
pretty reductive way of thinking about the kind of histories that paleontologists are telling, though. The kinds of evolutionary pressures that, for instance, the kinds of pressures that govern the evolution of forms 550 million years ago are radically different than those 200 million years ago, and are radically different than those 65 million years ago, and that's exactly why it's a historical science.
Right.
It's exactly the same, it's exactly the analogous function to the change in norms between the Greeks and the Romans.
I don't think so. Your own example, the laws of gravity, didn't they exist that time ago?
The climate was different, the other organisms around were different, exactly the way that the states were different and the thoughts of the people were different.
I doubt that.
Well, the climate was different, but the ways in which you explain the way in which was different is the same by which you explain, climate change now.
You don't apply to other laws of nature.
Yeah.
They're
the
not
laws
different.
of nature don't feature in the explanations of paleontologists, not directly.
Okay, so what about
But indirectly they do.
Yeah.
Well, and so they do in human history.
Okay, so this was an example I was going to use tomorrow. I was going to reserve it, but I'm going to use it now because it's relevant. So, I mean, recently, well, maybe not so recently now, but the case of the Denisovan girl, yeah?
Sure, yeah.
So they found this tiny little bone fragment, which was about 2.5 centimeters, and they actually, and they said, right, from that, so it was the small finger, and it was the intersection between two phalanges, yeah? So, and they actually managed to reconstruct what approximately would have been the age at which she died, yeah, because the phalanges fuse at a certain point in life. They weren't completely fused, but they were almost fused, so she must have been an adolescent. But in order to do that, they looked at how contemporary humans, how the phalanges fuse in contemporary humans. So they presupposed that in a way, that in contemporary humans, the phalanges fuse in the same way in which they fused 60,000 or 80,000 years ago, whatever, you know, the Denisovan was found. So that is an assumption that, you know, the same kind of processes, maybe these are not laws, these are processes, but the same sort of processes are at work. Now that is not something that a humanistic historian can presuppose. Of course, you know, they would assume that volcanoes, you know, erupted in the same ways in which they erupt now, but they would not assume that people might get angry at the same things that they get angry now, or that they would disapprove of the same things that we might disapprove of now. So in that sense, I think that paleontology does, you know, look at a past that under a different description, under a different categorical description from the one that humanistic history does. And I think it's at a very fundamental level that, you know, in a way you could say that Collingwood is doing a kind of, it's not ontology, of course, in any kind of normal, you know, ordinary sense of the word, but it's a kind of fundamental ontology in a way, because it's saying there are certain fundamental categories. So the past, for the paleontologist, is really a different kind of past. This is not that the historian would say, well, volcanoes erupted in a different way, but when it does that, I think he's not really speaking as an historian in the humanistic sense. It's shifted to a different, I think, to a different worldview, or, you know, to a different way of understanding the past. But there is a lot of literature now which does say, oh look, we should understand, you know, the historical sciences don't quite follow the same method as the hard sciences, as physics. You know, there are historical sciences, geology, evolutionary biology, and history is like that. But I do think that that's a different way of naturalizing humanistic history, which doesn't, I suppose, reduces to a hard science like, you know, physics perhaps, but nonetheless still does not acknowledge its full autonomy.
Is it still action the fundamental? Is that what it comes down to then?
Yeah.
Collingwood. So this is interesting to me because Collingwood's an archaeologist, or at least he does some work in archaeology, I know. And archaeology seems to be. So at what moment do we get to start telling action stories? Because this must have been a question that preoccupied Collingwood. At some point there aren't any agents, and then at some point there are agents. And I guess he's coming from an idealist tradition. It's not surprising to me that there's a stark break there. But I'm interested by this idea because he must have seen then there's sort of an advent of the possibility of a new kind of enterprise at some moment.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, so I suppose, you know, again, archaeology, what sort of archaeology? Because, you know, what kind of questions does archaeology answer?
I'm taking, say Neanderthal burial practices. So let's take something that looks a lot like humanistic history. So.
Yeah.
But that's so that's humanistic. Well, I don't think that would be well. I would say that Neanderthal is not, so it's human history, but it's not humanistic history. So I don't think that humanistic history, so I don't think that Collingwood believes that humanistic history is equal to human history, because if you do study, as you know, the Neanderthal, and you use forensic archaeology to date their bones, you're a scientist that happens to study humans. You're not a humanistic historian, and in fact, presumably, unless you think that you can read off their system of beliefs or the norms by which they live off their bones, off their DNAs, then you're doing something else, which is very interesting. I mean, I think that this sort of stuff that they can know from this bit.
Out of their burial practices, though, that seems more like.
But burial practices are cultural phenomena.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So they're actions. So
Yeah.
you can explain them by humanistic explanation. In fact, that's the only way you can explain them. Otherwise, it's just a group of bones lying there.
Yeah.
If you say it's a burial practice, it's an action, and you can understand it.
Yeah,
No
because
problem.
because then you understand it in relation to the practice of burying the people who are.
But here, perhaps the present isn't concerned. I think this is where the present is, the worry about the role of our present categories becomes a bit even perhaps more acute. Because we're projecting into a realm that's so different from our own.
Yeah.
This is where, I mean, I'm rejoining your point from earlier, yeah.
Right. Well, but the sort of fundamental point is that there are two different ways of understanding it, is it? By carbon dating the bones, and by understanding them as being the remains of a human who was buried. So, when you carbon date the bones, or when you kind of look at it from an anatomical point of view, you can say, well, this was a female human in her 40s who died approximately however many years ago. But that's a different, I suppose what Colin would say, is a different complex of questions and answer from the questions of, why was she buried with her sword? Yeah.
With a coin on the eyes.
Yeah.
Just like that. Yeah.
So, but I think there are times, I suppose, that the least humanistic information you have, the more you may try and make the sort of scientific information which work, but it only goes. I think it only goes so far. There's a point in which you can say, well.
That's who's right. Thanks.
We all agree.
So if I understood correctly, then there is two different ways to do science, which are not related to actual disciplines. So maybe to renew the discussion, I would have a question: that could we do natural science in a humanistic way? Could we do humanistic physics, for example? Can we study the way causes work or something like that in a humanistic way? Is it possible? Because it seems that from your discussion that you could do a humanistic history or more scientific history, and could do the same with other sciences then? Humanistic sociology and scientific sociology, for example? Do you think so? Or?
Well, you could do the sociology of physics, you can do the history of physics, yeah? I'm not sure that...
So could you do physics in a way that you you put in the front agents in a way, like agents acting and doing stuff, but you look at it with physics? Or is physics basically, is natural sciences forced to use scientific understanding? That's my question basically. Does it make sense? Maybe it doesn't.
Well,
it's like, so for example, sorry, just to take an example, maybe physics is maybe too hard to think about it like in this way. But if you look at life sciences, could you take the animals or whatever as agents and think of them humanistically speaking, and then could you do humanistic biology?
okay. I see what you mean. So I suppose that I'm going to start and say something about what Collingwood might say, and then see whether what Collingwood might say is that there is a kind of. So I don't think he was trying to answer the question: are animals historical agents? So I don't think, he was sort of trying to address the question, is it just humans who are historical agents? I mean, he did think that, really, mostly by and large, but I don't think he was trying to settle that question as to who is and isn't an historical agent. But if you do take them to be historical agents, then in a way you understand them in a particular way. So I suppose for him there is a kind of reciprocal relationship between the conceptual question, what you're studying, and the epistemological question, how are you going to study it? And I would say that there wouldn't be much sense in trying to provide, I might be proved to be wrong, but that there is much sense in trying to provide a humanistic history of shrimps or of mussels, in the sense of the not the human mussels, the Belgian mussels. So, I might be proved to be wrong. I'm open to be proved to be wrong. But I would say that they don't have a history. They have a natural history, but they don't have a human. It makes no sense to provide a humanistic history. Then there are maybe borderline cases where it may make sense. Perhaps you can. Elephants you might think of the ways in which they return to the places where some of them died. Maybe that is a kind of quasi-historical practice. And so, there are people writing animalistic histories, and but I think that again, it's not that these things cannot be done, but
that's not really what is bothering him.
But also, is there somebody writing histories from the point of view of cows? I think there are animalistic history. Now, people are doing animalistic histories. But I think that this history are actually humans trying to understand how cows view them, rather than being really histories from
Cows don't write, do they?
Well, I don't want to sound like there is a huge divide between humans and animals, because we are animals. But insofar as we are animals, we do have this sort of evolutionary history of humans. And the question is to whether we can write history of animals, which are history in the humanistic sense, depends on whether they really have historical agency. Whether we take them to have historical agency. My bet is that shrimps don't have historical agency.
But because from what I've understood, it's a question of what the categories you choose to inquire with. It's a question of choice of your categories at the start. So you could very well choose to take the categories of that makes shrimps have social or cultural stuff.
Okay.
Even if at the end you end up saying that, well, there is probably not something that we can call culture or sociology or whatever, or humanistic point of view from a shrimp, but it could be like an inquiry that you could start with, right? And the same way maybe you could, because it's a metaphilosophical question, but how you approach the sciences, from what I've understood, and so why couldn't you use these categories for other stuff and look if it makes sense or not?
Okay. Yeah. So.
Well, that's one way where it matters today to use Collingwood's point of view.
Yeah. I guess that maybe sometimes I have made it sound like it's a kind of, it's just a voluntaristic decision. So you can pick and choose which history to tell, yeah. But I don't think that you can. Although there is it's a judgment call as to which history you're going to tell. I think it's a judgment call, but I don't think it's just that you can just decide, I'm going to use this history rather than the other. I think that there are cases, I would say in the case of shrimps, it wouldn't be appropriate to use humanistic history. There are cases where you might have an argument about that. But I don't think it's like you just pick and choose in a way. To some extent, you have to look at what is your subject matter and whether it's amenable to be. It lends itself, let's say, to be explained in that way or not.
Which is going away from constructivism. So it's a point against constructivism in this sense. Because if you are fully constructivist, you would say that you choose the categories fully.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I don't think it's a.
Because you need an argument that if you say that your subject matter is telling you which category to choose, you're going away from constructivism.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that your subject matter. I suppose the subject matter here is ambiguous in a sense, because on the one hand it means is what is defined by the kind of explanation which is being given, and on the other hand is the thing that you're trying to explain. So the judgment call is about whether the thing that you are trying to explain should be subsumed under the subject matter of a humanistic pursuit. That's the judgment call that needs to be made. But you're right. In that sense, it's not a. You can't just will to teach to explain something humanistically. You can't say, well, in that sense, you cannot give a humanistic physics. I think that would. I think Collingwood would probably say that's a contradiction in terms.
I agree. He also is talking in the New Leviathan about the distinction between mind and body. That's seen as a huge problem in philosophy. And Collingwood says, no, it's not a problem at all. Man is all body if you study him physically, and he's all mind if you study him historically.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah, he is no interactionist.
No, that's it.
Yeah.
That's it. And you should not study historical problems with the methods of the sciences, of the natural sciences. That doesn't work. Point.
Yes, I might have a question which is, I think, related to what you just said, but during the discussion you made a distinction between human history and humanistic history, right? And you took the example of archaeology, and I was wondering if, in one sense, archaeology is not maybe the borderline case for that idea, because you can study either something with what you say was human history or with humanistic history. So I was wondering whether you could clarify a bit what would be a human history and what is the opposition with humanistic approach in history.
Yeah, so perhaps this is why, in a way, one shouldn't closely identify a form of inquiry with a discipline or with a particular, so because if you take, because I don't think there is any discipline which is ever pure in that sense. So I think that historians provide sometimes in history books you find claims which are scientific claims. Yeah. So I mean, in an history book, somebody might talk about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, and back in at the times of Pompeii. And and they might provide, might give a brief explanations of why it erupted, which is a scientific explanation. Yeah. So I think that that it's not as if these ways of knowing are are in sealed containers, yeah? And on the other hand, you get historians that never provide scientific explanations, and on the other hand, there are scientists who never provide historical, quasi-historical explanations. It's just that it's telling the difference between which one is which, yeah? So with archaeology, you could think, if you think of the archaeologist asking the question, what was this thing used for? Was this an item of jewelry? Yeah, then that is a kind of humanistic question. Yeah, but if on the other hand the archaeologist is saying, right, when does it date back to? Yeah, precisely, then that's a different kind of question. And they're mutually supportive, but they're not. But they're different complexes of questions and answers.
Okay.
But you're right that sometimes people think, well, that archaeology is the handmaiden of history, so that archaeology just provides the facts, and history, on the other hand, uses them. But that's a particular conception of what.
I think it's close to what Charles said, like saying that there is no pure distinction between in this particular example. So, now if you want to.
I think you will say something a bit more robust than that. Perhaps. I think you wanted.
Well, yeah, I thought it was the main idea that there is no.
That's part of it. The more robust bit would be to say that I find the methodological overlap more important than the metaphysical difference between what the archaeologist is doing in that context and what the humanistic historian is doing. That would be the more robust claim, the more provocative claim.
Yeah. I guess that, what is it that Collingwood would say? He would say, right, okay, so in some sense you could say, sometimes people are trying to find origins. But there are different origins that you can find. So, okay, say that there is a church in England, it's called Enscombe Church, and it was built with stones which were harvested from a Roman fort. Okay, so you might want to find the origins of those stones, yeah? But, there are different ways in which you can sort of find their origin. You may want to know, geologically, what their geological origin is, or you want to know, what their provenance was. And if you want to know in a kind of more humanistic sense, and then you're not interested in the geological period they were formed, but, and the kind of evidence that you would, the epistemology that it would use is different, because then what would be proved to you that there were harvested from a Roman fort is that there was an inscription in Latin, So, but that is not like the ways in which the geologists would reconstruct the age of the stone. Yeah, so those epistemologies are quite different, because what the historian may want to know, is where do the stones come from, in the sense of where were they before, what kind of buildings were they taken from, whereas the geologist wants to know, how were they formed, millions of years ago, or.
No, I get the distinction. The methodological overlap would be that for the geologist, that looks a whole lot like the reconstruction of traces of events that occurred in the past. And
Well,
for the historian, it also looks a whole lot like the reconstruction
Yeah.
of the traces of events
Yeah,
that occurred in the
so
past.
at a very general level, they are both reconstructing the traces of what happened in the past. But the way in which they're reconstructing those traces is quite different, because the traces that the geologist looks for.
At a technical level, yes,
Yeah.
of course, yes, yes. That I'm not disagreeing
Yeah.
with that. No, I think well, we're heading toward a relative significance question, right? Which is more interesting, the sort of metaphysical presence of an action, presence or absence of a norm-guided action, or the characteristics of the methodology by which we arrive at the knowledge that's generated. I think it's a relative significance question at some point, right? And I think for Collingwood, it's clear that that ontological difference is primary. Or at least this is how I'm hearing both of you present Collingwood, is that ontological difference is primary.
Yeah.
But well, with my philosopher of science hat on, I find the methodological similarity more interesting. But that's you know, some people like mussels and some people like French fries.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are.
It's more fundamental like that, I think.
Perhaps.
For Collingwood it is,
Yeah.
at least.
Well, yeah. He has a clear position on the question.
Yeah, okay. And I think he's right.
It's already half past 5. We can
Yes.
maybe open the debate to
Yeah,
questions
please.
if there is a question.
Yeah, some question.
We're on
Yeah.
this one.
Thank you for the discussion. I'm confused about what is an historical agent in the context of humanistic history for Collingwood, because I think a lot of the debate about animals and things like that depend on what you mean by an historical agent. So what did he mean? To exclude or not
Okay.
this being or
Yeah.
not?
Okay. It's somebody who you understand through practices. So he says at some point, for example, I wish I was one of those people who can quote him by heart. I would need James Connolly here. But he says, look, people eat, people die, they live, but that's not what history studies. What it studies is the history of the ritual of funeral practices and weddings. So you
So what we
understand.
call culture.
Yeah. So you understand them in the context of those practices. So
Okay.
you understand an agent as somebody who leads their life by certain norms, which
That could
also
change.
they could change. Yeah. So that's the distinction, and also the distinction.
So if I understand you correctly, great apes are in that Neanderthal, because we understand them culturally, in big part, especially since we study, some specific group of great apes for decades. We see cultural change, the importance of certain leader, imposition of a certain new culture, new way to. So there could be historical agent of humanistic histories, but maybe not shrimps.
Yeah. So, so the important bit, I suppose, is not so much the change, but that how they related to those norms, the fact that they obey them and disobey them, yeah, as opposed to, so if water doesn't freeze, it would be falsifying
Oh, of course.
the laws of nature.
But
if- yeah.
Sorry, I
Yeah,
cut you.
yeah.
Sorry. I cut you in
Yeah.
the middle of a sentence.
Yeah, no, it's
Not
okay.
to-
It's
sorry,
okay.
please continue.
So I think the important bit is whether there is you interpret them as responding as being part of a practice,
Okay.
yeah, rather than instantiating a process or. So that's the important bit.
Okay.
So I suppose there is change in nature, but I suppose that is evolution. Those. And evolution is change of a kind, but it's not historical change,
Okay.
I think.
not in that sense, but cultural change in great apes, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
And Neanderthal, we guess, but we quite difficult to check.
Yeah, we don't know.
Okay, food for thought.
If I may, because one concern then is got some kind of epistemic hubris to think that
Sorry, epistemic?
Hubris or like outreach or going too far, but because in a way it's saying that everything that is culture look like human culture, right? So there is no possibility for other culture to exist or other stuff that are historical, but we cannot recognize as so because it doesn't look like enough what we think culture is or what we know culture to be for human at least.
Okay.
That's the point of this, but of speciesism basically, and what Alexander was pointing to, because sure we recognize culture in apes, but it took us a long time to recognize that for orcas, for example. There is practices that are being taught. We had the case with the orcas that are destroying a yacht in the Mediterranean Sea. And it's something that we finally recognize as being cultural, just because it looks, for once, like we think culture is supposed to look like, or practice is supposed to look like, right?
Well, that would be an epistemic failure. So it would be an epistemic failure to recognize that might be, might have its roots in some sort of misplaced sense of superiority, but it's an epistemic failure. It's not, I don't think that saying that undermines the conceptual distinction. But it is true that, maybe I will be proved wrong and shrimps actually, but I think that would be an epistemic failure. It wouldn't, I think, undermine the conceptual distinction. Well, I suspect that's how, I don't know, that's how I would defend Collingwood. And from the charge of speciesism.
I understand that. The point is that nothing else to say. Are there other questions in the room? Other questions? No? Yes.
No, I don't have any more questions. So
There is a question.
Yeah, there is a question.
Maybe it's a silly question, but is there any a priori element in Collingwood's conception of human nature? Because, I'm just thinking, I read a paper that you wrote about economics as a science, and it's quite interesting because he's probably using some elements of the Austrian school of economics. And for an economist, it's quite clear. For example, you can have laws in economics, like if I give you Venezuelan bolivares and euros, for example, you have a law that will say, for example, that you prefer to spend the bolivares and put the euros in your pocket, just because of the inflation, of course. So I would like to know if you can find the same element in history, for example. And my second question is there any example of this, of application of this conception of history by a historian?
So it is true that you will find generalizations in history, and that sometimes historians use them. I think that insofar as, what Collingwood is saying is that generalizations, it's not that historians cannot make generalizations, but that those generalizations, if they are proper history, then they must be informed by the cultural background and so on. So, of course, you can say things like, let me see, I'm just trying to do justice to that question, because there are generalizations in history, but that is not to say that history is, in that sense, a science like economics. So, he used, the example that he uses is, is that in some ways, the sort of generalizations that are appropriately historical are the kind of generalizations that often piggyback on norms. So so those are appropriate historical generalizations. But if you were, on the other hand, using generalizations that completely abstracts from the cultural context, then those would be, I think, not history. They would be something else. It's not that you cannot make them, but then, that social science is not a humanistic science.
But in his case, so the human action is predictable or not?
Well, so, yes, it is, but prediction, it depends on how you make the prediction. So, I remember, okay, let me see. Now, you predicted that I would come here today. Yeah? How did you predict it? I don't think you had a general law, or rather, you might have a generalization, but that generalization relies upon understanding that speakers who are invited to give a talk have an obligation to turn up, have an obligation to their audience to turn up. And to understand that is different from understanding that normally when people are invited to give a talk, they turn up. You can understand it in that way, okay? But that's a kind of routine generalizations, which is different from understanding why I turned up today by saying that I owed it to you to turn up. That's a humanistic explanation, that understands what I've done in terms of the practices of giving papers at universities and what is and isn't acceptable, how it is and it isn't acceptable to behave. So you can predict what I do, but there is a difference between predicting what somebody will do by using a rationalization and predicting what somebody will do by using a generalization. Yeah?
Just to make it parallel, actually, in economics, you can predict, for example, what will happen. In the case the example you gave, for example, I cannot predict that you come again here, because that's actually, these will not be predictable, but human action is predictable because I can apply these laws, for example, for different societies, like this law of economics that you always take the money that we reserve the value. But just to go to the second question, is there any example of application of this conception of history by a historian, or any work that you think that is...
He said that he was profoundly influenced by Collingwood. So he's a historian.
No, but Collingwood himself is an historian. He wrote brilliant books about Roman history. He wrote about the economics of Roman history. Read him. You have the best example of an historian. He's a very good historian. When he died, people wrote to the paper, a famous historian dies, not a famous philosopher dies.
But he didn't make his school. And no.
He did make a school as an historian, yes. He was the mentor of many historians, or archaeologists, antiquarians really, so writing about Roman history mainly. But he was a very, very good historian. Read his Roman Britain and the English settlements, it's brilliant. It's the best example of how you should write history. And he's combining archaeology and history all the time. So he's a genius, I think, in combining insights from archaeology and history and coming to conclusions. And it's not about separating the disciplines, no, he wants to understand the past, and he uses archaeology and he uses history combined. But
Thanks.
I don't think that he would say that, I don't know much about economics, so maybe you can tell me, but I know there are some economists that can tell you things by relating them to what happens to the price of the Mars bar, and they can tell you all sorts of things that are going to happen. I think that he would say that those kind of predictions have no place in history, either prospectively, but history is retrospective, but those kind of things are not the kind of generalizations that historians make. On the other hand, he would say, you can generalize and say, well, people who lived in a certain period of time tended to behave in certain ways, insofar as, but that generalization, relies on a norm of behavior, because that is how they were expected to behave. So once you have a normative expectation, you can generalize, and those generalizations exist in history, and they're proper historical generalizations, but they don't abstract from, but they're different kind of generalizations from the ones that, on the other hand, completely abstract from the ways in which agents understood themselves.
that's what he holds against psychology of his days. Exactly.
Thank you. I think there is another last
last
question, maybe.
No, sorry, it's going to be two very silly questions because I'm no Collingwood specialist. I read him when I was a literature student, so it's kind of fuzzy in my memory. So anyway, my first question is, can an agent be conscious of the absolute presuppositions of his society? According to Collingwood Matters.
So what he would say is, so I think that what he's interested in, and not so much, so history is, I suppose, concerned with some of the fundamental beliefs that people have, But in terms of his metaphysics, he is concerned with the presuppositions that govern different ways of coming to know the world, of which history, and I know this in science, but I am very aware that it's too broad in many ways. So he would say that you don't need to consciously entertain a presupposition. So, if you are a doctor, you don't have to think that. You don't have to be consciously aware of the fact that it is possible for you to change the course of nature. But you must presuppose it, because otherwise you would not try to make your patients better. So that's what he would say, is that a presupposition is something that doesn't need to be consciously entertained, but it is one that you can make explicit, and that is what it takes philosophy to be doing. So when he's thinking about historians, he's asking what are the presuppositions that they are making that gives rise to the kind of questions that they ask, and how do they differ from the presuppositions that, on the other hand, are asked in different contexts of inquiry, which give rise to different kind of questions, which in turn demand different kind of answers. So I think the answer would be you can come to know, and it must be possible to do that, because in a way, what he thinks is that there is a kind of entailment relationship between propositional answers, the questions that they're answers to, and the presuppositions that give rise to them. So it must be possible to get, to trace them back. It's logical detective work. Yeah? So it's possible to do it. Yeah.
My question, and my second question will be already answered, so it's okay.
Is there any other question or?
5 minutes.
Okay.
Time for questions. Someone.
Okay.
But it's in the same. It's just to better understand how you build an agent, the norm, an explanation based on the fact that agents follow norms. So I can understand. Okay, I want to explain why Caesar crossed the Rubicon. So of course, there he violates a clear cultural norm.
Mm-hmm.
But I can explain it by his motivation or the guess that we have about his motivation based on something later to explain why this specific human being decided not to follow a very important norm, not to cross a Rubicon with an army. That's not a minor norm. He spent days thinking before crossing near the river. But can I explain random actions of someone that acts without reason, which probably most of us, most of the time?
Can you give an example of an act without a reason?
I don't know.
That I was afraid of.
People do bizarre things and they say, I don't know.
Give me an example.
A lot of people kill their wife and they say, I don't know. In the middle of the action, I lost calm, I was in a bar and I hit the guy.
Not the best example.
So, would it be outside humanistic explanation or there's room for explanation that are difficult to find?
Well, as an historian, I would say Hitler is the best example. An historian never says Hitler was mad. He always tries to understand them, and that's exactly what Collingwood wants you to do. Try to understand them as far as possible, and only in the last resort you say, okay, I can't understand him, he's mad. But that says something about you, not about him. It shows you an inability to understand him. That's what Collingwood says.
But why I don't know, that would be my answer too, but I don't understand because it's an epistemological answer, is that you're charitable and you go to maximize the rationality of every actor to understand their behavior based on reason, even reason complex, but that's not a metaphysical discussion. So does it mean that according to Collingwood, the axiom is that every action of human is based on reason, even if the person does not know his reason?
I think it is.
Is it metaphysically what it is to be an agent? Is to have always reason?
So, yes, but not all the things we do are actions.
Okay.
So there are some things which we do that are not actions in Collingwood's sense. So there is. So actions are, in a way, it's a technical. It's a technical sense. So he's not doing. I don't think he's doing linguistic phenomenology. Is doing. Is looking at the relevant, at an important sort of categorical distinction.
Okay.
So
that's the job of a historian, to study those actions that are based on reason, even if they are not known by the subject themselves. And when it's not the case, it's not history.
I don't think he necessarily, this is something that Dre used to say, that I don't think that it's necessarily the case that in order to ascribe somebody a reason for acting, they necessarily had to go through some sort of internal monologue. I mean, I do think that I think that we can actually rationalize our own conduct in the way in which we rationalize that of others. It's not as if in our own case we appeal to a monologue that we had, whereas in the case of others we just use rationalizations. I think that, so I don't think he thought that there had to be necessarily a monologue.
I'm just trying to understand the kind of reasons an historian, humanistic historian, can attribute or not to explain actions.
Well, I mean, the sort of common misunderstanding of Collingwood, maybe you also want to say something, is that somehow he couldn't deliver explanations of actions other than by assuming that he had some sort of psychic powers to enter the minds of other people. But I think the ways in which he says we understand actions is just very much like I understand you. So I know that if you're raising your hand, you're asking a question, yeah? I know that there is a practice in academic circles of raising a finger, which means that you are following up. So that's how I understand what you are doing, in a way. And I think that's how I understand you. If you raise your hand, it's because I take it. I mean, it's possible that I must have misunderstood you because you were trying to catch a fly, and but if I have understood, but what does it mean to understand it? It means to sort of know the practice of raising the hand and then seeing that that's what you were doing. You were raising a hand because you wanted to ask a question, yeah? I could get you wrong, and
But that is following the rules. I think okay, that's easy explanation. The problem is the Rubicon. So when someone decides to go against a norm, and that's an important point of history because we believe that when that kind of human have a lot of powers, they can do a lot of stuff, and that's the answer. Because as an historian, okay, I know that crossing the Rubicon it's not just a minor norm, it's a super norm. But Julius Caesar, a very special character, blah, 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 motivate, dictator, whatever. And even him took time. It's why it took time, because it was a super norm, it was a very important norm, but he still decided to do it, and now I have to explain it as a historian, why. And I say, okay, because based on his motivation, maybe something I know before, or on traces of what he did after, saying, oh, maybe he had always that motivation before to go against the norm, and of course, it's rare for humans to go against social norms of that importance, so there must be important explanation to motivate that. So I try to, because I know that Collingwood says I have to put myself in the mind of Caesar. No way I can do that. It's Julius Caesar. So how do I do it?
So is the case of disobeying?
Because it's a case, disobeying a major norm.
Yeah, but is the case of disobeying fundamentally different from the case of obeying? I think his point is that agents are responsive to norms, but they can be responsive to norms either by obeying or disobeying them.
So it would be a symmetrical explanation. Is what you're saying?
I think it would be a symmetrical explanation. So, if I was trying to think of an example.
I thought there was a symmetric there, but maybe, for that kind of character, disobeying to a norm is symmetrical. Because of the kind of character.
Well, I suppose a lot of these historical cases are actually cases of disobedience rather than obedience.
Yeah, we prefer study Hitler and Julius Caesar and a good government. So often we are interested.
I have just a very short question about this, maybe particular to Herman as a historian. Has from the outside and from the discipline of the history of archaeology, Collingwood's own practice of history been criticized as being elitist?
No.
No?
Why? Why would it be elitist?
Because he ultimately focuses on those artifacts of the past that he believes we can understand. So basically, important things, and not meaningless things, like not heaps of shells, for instance, but Roman settlements and, well, Caesar and Hitler, as you just said, basically.
But Roman settlements are about ordinary Romans, for example.
Mhm.
When he's writing about Roman Britain, he's writing about the ordinary Roman, not about the elite only.
No, but I mean, not elite in the sense we were talking about speciesism earlier.
Yeah.
Very still anthropocentric.
Mhm. So,
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, he's writing about human history. Is about humans for him.
So that is clear.
That is clear.
Well,
Yeah.
although,
By actions,
yeah.
by humans, to be specific. But
so
Which means that natural beings would only have a meaning if they're related to human
Yeah.
activity.
in the idea of history, he explicitly writes, for example, on floods. Floods are interesting for historians, not as such, but in the way humans react. So, what's the cultural reaction to a flood? That's the question an historian answers.
but I think there is a distinction between saying that humanistic history ends up being about humans because they are the kind of beings who abide by norms, and saying that it is anthropocentric with a kind of negative tinge. I take it that when you were raising that you were using anthropocentric in a non-negative sense.
Yeah.
I think you were using it in a negative.
I was just
with a
asking
negative-
really how
Yeah.
in the framework of history there was no...
But
somebody who's not me could use
Yeah.
it in a negative sense. I can impersonate some of my
no, absolutely.
colleagues if
So,
you want.
but
Then yes.
But there are histories of shells. There are history. It's just that they're not humanistic history. So this is not to say that they're not worth that there isn't a worthwhile enterprise which is about shells but that it's a different kind of history.
Mhm.
So,
Which is not the one he wants to practice.
well, I think all that he is saying is that acknowledge a distinction between these kinds of histories. Acknowledge that they are looking for different kind of evidence, yeah, and that the sort of their epistemologies matches their explanandum. But he is not saying that I don't think he would say, oh, you can't call evolutionary history, or you can't call geological history. Of course it is history. He is not saying that only one kind of history is, this debate about which is real and which is not real is like the trans debate about which is a real woman, which isn't a real woman. The question is not what is real and what isn't real. The question is about what it is that one is trying to explain. Yeah. So if your goal is to understand something in the context of a practice, then you're giving a certain kind of history. If your goal is to understand the process, then you're giving a different kind of history. They're both history, yeah? But one is a humanistic history and the other is not a humanistic history. It's a scientific history. So in some sense, he wanted to, he didn't want that debate about which absolute presupposition is the true presupposition, which is the real presupposition, yeah? So, because that would be asking the sort of, doing the kind of metaphysics which he was trying to eschew. He didn't want that. So he wanted to say there's a time and a place for this kind of history, there's a time and a place for this other kind of history, and what he was against was the claim, the attempt to try and subsume all history under a kind of naturalistic history. That he didn't want. But he also didn't want to say that there isn't a naturalistic history. I think he would have.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation.